Okay, class. With this lecture, we're going to turn to North America, and we'll go to the earliest hominin occupation um, of the Americas. I want you to look on the lower left here. Once again, we are an African species, right? And the first of our ancestors to radiate out of Africa were Homo erectus. Whatever happened to Homo erectus, we really don't know. It's quite a problem. Um, um, but eventually, Homo sapiens sapiens would emerge again in East Africa and have what's called the second radiation, or the spread out of Africa. And the dates now for that are about 160,000 BC. That is when they left Africa. But unlike Homo erectus, Homo sapiens wouldn't stay in Asia. And they would cross into North America and eventually South America. And there form the group that is called by archaeologists the Paleo Indians. This is primarily North America. We'll talk about Mesoamerica and South America later. But primarily that's where this term is used. Um, and the date of when they come in has been a matter of great debate, and a lot has changed just in my lifetime, in the last 30 years. But we have to keep in mind that at times of lower sea level, as we can see in the upper right, where you see sort of the lighter green around the continent, and then the blue sea. Well, those are the continental shelves, and that was where the shore was during times of maximum glaciations, when there was a lot of the water on the planet was sucked up into the poles, and the sea levels were quite much lower. Uh, and when that was really serious, all of Canada was covered. And the glaciers came well down into Indiana, formed the Great Lakes, and flattened much of the Midwest, and as well as Canada. But when it would recede a little bit, there was a path from the northwest across the Bering Straits and down into the Americas. Uh, and we'll talk about when that happens. But the important thing to keep in mind is we're purely Homo sapiens sapiens in the Americas. There are no Neanderthals. There are no anything else as far as we can tell. However, the date has changed of when they got here, and that's a really interesting part to know. Now, I just want to give you some terminology and chronology here. Just these are the region, the geographical regions of these cultures. They'll get more culturally specific in those regions as we go along. But what I want to point out is that it's not fair to call to group North American Native Americans as one group. There were a bunch of different groups, as we all know. North America is a huge continent, and there were different groups of Native Americans, just like there were throughout the world. And frequently these have to do with their geography and what sort of climates they're adapted to. Okay, I just want to point this out. Don't pay attention to the Ohio region, or specifically the terms like Middle Woodland period versus Hopewell culture, etc. What I just want to point out is the chronology. And when I was a student, it started at about that purple area where it said Paleo Indian, and that's was also called the Clovis culture, which I'll discuss in a moment, because of the Clovis point. Um, Now, and then then there was different developments, quite frankly, in stone tool technologies that had archaeologists changing the names of the cultures. We now know that there was pre-Clovis. And that's changing a lot. And when I mean a lot, I mean especially in like the last 10 years. Um, when people started finding these sites that dated earlier than the Clovis period, the Paleo-Indian period, about 14,000 BP, they were seriously questioned, and I mean seriously questioned. They were completely dismissed. Scholars were just, not listened to, who argued that they had sites dating earlier than Clovis. And it got pretty serious. I mean, there was one guy who complained that his colleagues would call his dean and say he should be fired. This sort of stuff. I mean, it was really people got really angry with it, and the idea is because these Clovis culture, the Clovis culture had been so well established as the first culture in North America that books and books and books and people's whole careers were built on it, and now it seems to be quite wrong, and we're getting much earlier dates, which we just call pre-Clovis right now, going back to about 20,000 BP. But once again, this Homo sapiens, and I want you to look at this old chronology of when the Americas were occupied in relationship to everything else. You don't have to know anything too much from the middle or the right. And once again, on the top left where it says humans crossed land bridge between Asia and North America, we can put that back about 20,000 BP now. And then they would have their own domestication of corn in Central America, Mesoamerica, and then other civilizations would emerge. So the dates of this have been pushed back quite a bit, and they continue to be. And there's pretty amazing sites in the North Americas. We sort of have a Eurocentric view of the world, and don't realize how rich the archaeological remains are around us. There are the mound builders that are around the Ohio Valley in the east, and then these cliff dwellers on the bottom right is a site called Mesa Verde down in the New Mexico area, and so we'll see these are vastly different types of sites, and there's different types of people, and we're going to talk about all that. But it's really fascinating, this culture. Now, one of the problems that happened early on, talking about, there was, a lot of Eurocentric racism throughout, North American, European contact and beyond history. And these mounds were found. And one of the things that went without saying as far as the European scholars were concerned is whoever built them, they weren't the ancestors of the Indians or the Native Americans that live in North America, because those people were just not sophisticated enough to have built them. They presumed. They were wrong. This was a purely racist point of view. But they had some pretty wild theories. One of which is, and I believe I mentioned this before, is that the lost tribe of Israel came and built these, because of course no Indian would have built it. So maybe it was the lost tribe of Israel. And, that was taken very seriously for a long time, as bizarre as it sounds. Now it's taken quite seriously. And as a matter of fact, the guy who starts the Mormon faith claims to have dug up tablets in a mound, I believe in New York, and then, read them and published them as the Book of Mormon, and then proceeded to lose the tablets, conveniently enough. And that's where Mormonism comes from, is the belief that these things were in fact remnants of the lost tribe of Israel. That's why they call themselves the Latter-day Saints, or part of the reason, I should say. But these mounds were around. People were finding them. Thomas Jefferson seems to have thought that they could have been built by the Native Americans, but and he did some archaeology in this, but nobody else did. And we have, proper. Eventually, we'll get proper villages in these mounds that I just showed you. And quite frankly, as these, wooden and mud brick houses collapsed, they would build a little mound, anthropogenic mound, just like the tells we saw in Europe. Now, what used to be considered the earliest culture was the Clovis culture. Once again, this has changed since I've been in school. But let's talk a little bit about this and the problems surrounding it. First of all, I wanted to point out on the left there, we can see that bright green before the blue, but not on the continent, and that's how big the continent was at the time. And they came over from Asia. Now, you've got to remember that these are Homo sapiens that have been hunting and gathering for 100 she's 170, 180,000 years by this point. And they made excellent killing tools, and one of which is called the Clovis Point, which we see on the right hand side. There's a site in the southwest called Clovis, and that's where they first found these, and that's how it got the name for the culture. This is common in archaeology to name a culture after the first place was found. But you can see that these are wonderful spear tips. These guys were really good. And one of the things that happens is that North America, at the same time that they come in, loses a whole bunch of species, which I'll show you in a moment. But most important, or most interestingly, is the North American mammoth. Let's look at the bottom real quick, as we can see that the passageway in western Canada, where people could come down and sort of slide in between the ice and make it down into farther south. And we can see another reconstruction of that on the right. And that's how we think that these people got there at the time. And once again, there was a whole bunch of animals. There were large mammals that were in North America. There were lions, camels, mastodon, saber-toothed tigers, a native horse that went extinct and was reintroduced by the Spaniard, a different type of horse introduced by the Spaniard, the ground sloth, etc. And most of these animals were hunted to extinction. We have to keep in mind that they evolved in North America without any Homo sapiens around, and therefore had never been hunted. And what happens in that situation is that if they've never been hunted, they're naive to hunting. Basically, they don't know to run away. And we know when this event happens on islands, where let's say Europeans get to an island and there's an animal like the dodo bird that evolved there in complete isolation and so defenseless, it had no need for defense to the point that it even lost its ability to use its wings. And then the Portuguese got there, and in a matter of 12 years, they brought about its extinction. Dodo is just Portuguese for stupid, if I'm informed correctly. And they thought they were just stupid birds because they would walk up and they could kill one, and the next one would just walk right up. And dodo birds were big birds, right? They came up above the waist, so they had a lot of meat on them. And so our ancestors come in from Asia, and they have these excellent hunting tools, and they go up against all these naive animals. And even though there are saber-toothed cats, etc., and American lions, and they had not been hunted by humans before, and with this excellent hunting technology. And it's now believed that humans caused their extinction. There's a big battle of did climate cause the extinction, because it was coming out of the ice age, or was in the ice age, I should say, at the height of the last ice age, or humans. It's seeming suggesting that it looks like it was humans. And we have mammoth kill sites, sort of reconstructed here to give you the idea of how big a mammoth was in comparison to us. They weren't small animals. And they had to be taken down by, several people. And so what it shows here is a community organization in order to hunt the animal. And by the way, this is point, once you kill this animal, there's a lot of meat on it. So you don't have forever to eat it. And so not only do you need the people to hunt it, you need the people to be, efficient consumers of the beast. And here are just some sites. These are not all the sites that we now date to Clovis and earlier. There's several have emerged, but they're sporadic here and there, but they are all over North America. And once again, you can see where Clovis is there, where this was first found. But there are other interesting sites. Meadowcroft in southwestern Pennsylvania, near where I'm from, that's been being dug for a long time, and they now know that it goes back much earlier than the Clovis. So we have what's now called the pre-Clovis culture. And the pre-Clovis culture and the Clovis culture would hunt many animals to extinction. And here we see a mammoth kill site. One of the things they would do is, they could kill these animals with their weapons, But that's hard, And one of the things they would do is they would work as a group to either scare mammoths off cliffs, quite frankly, and so they'd break their own necks falling off a cliff, and then you just go down and slaughter the animal. You don't have to hunt it, which could be quite dangerous. You could also do. They also did something else, which is they would light fires around them and force them to run off cliffs. Um, and so up in the American Northwest, like Montana especially, has a lot of these Clovis or pre-Clovis and Clovis kill sites. Here are some of the tools of these early Paleo Indians, and a lot of these are used for the chronology. And boy, oh boy, you got to be a good eye with stone tools to see all the different, just a small amount of differences, here. But these guys are quite good at it, and they can tell the difference between, Middle Paleo Indian and Early Paleo Indian, etc. And they also show, that they use a lot of different resources. Once again, to make stone tools like this, you need something like flint or obsidian, stone that breaks like glass. And so they had to know their geology, and they exploited it to make excellent killing tools like these. I wish we were having class in person. I'd bring you some replicas of these just to see how lethal and nasty these spearheads were. And a lot of them were found. Just a lot of them were found all over North America. And boy, they were nice pieces. You can see on the left, they're even fluted, so they can get on the left-hand side of that one of the top left. You can see it's fluted, so it can take the shaft of the spear. And when they lost this piece, man, that guy or gal must have been really annoyed because this took a lot of work, and these guys were good stone knappers. Once again, I urge you all to just try to stone knap once in your life, and then you'll have a new appreciation for just how sophisticated these Native American arrowheads are. They are spectacularly well made, and they are lethal, lethal, lethal hunting tools. Here's just another shot. Don't worry about the one on the left. I just wanted to show you the one on the right here, just in relationship to a human, how big they are and the variety of them. They are nice tools. So these people, coming from Asia, having been hunting for, 170,000 years or so, and they're really skilled hunters, and they come into North America, and they just wipe out a whole bunch of species. Now, on the upper left, we see this hypothesis that they're coming down across the Bering Straits and then down through this place with the glaciers were not as thick. There's a new hypothesis, though, too, and we can see it reconstructed on the bottom right. It's called the Solutrean hypothesis. Now, the Solutreans were the culture in Europe, an Upper Paleolithic culture. And this has recently been argued. This guy thinks that they made it into North America from from Greenland, Iceland, that area. And because there's different points, which I'll show you in a moment, the different types of tools, but they look very, very much like what's being used in Europe at the time. So we see here, weapons like these leaf points. These are very similar to what was in Europe. So they, a lot of people think like on the upper right they came from Europe. This has gotten a lot of pushback, especially from Native Americans, because they just think it's another example of white men, trying to show the colonialization of everywhere. I'm not qualified to say by any means. But that's sort of one of the battles that's out there, and that this pre-Clovis cultures perhaps came from Europe, also as from the Asia. They're not excluding Asia; they're just adding it. And here, once again, are just some more maps to give you an idea of. On the upper left, you can see that blue area is the top, where it shows how far down the glaciers would have made it, and then how these Homo sapiens could come into North America. And once again, if with the Solutrean hypothesis recently published and across the Atlantic ice. Well, not recently, but in the last 10 years or so. And the wonderful points that are in the middle there. But on the top left, I want you to look at that how far down the glaciers go. They go way down into lower, they cover all of the northern Midwest. In Europe, they get down to the Alps, right, and almost the Pyrenees. And so what's thought is that the people could hug the edge of these glaciers and therefore not be stuck at open water too much, and then make it to North America. Recently, however, some really important changes and discoveries have occurred. And the most famous is the site of Monteverde, located down in South America. And this has much earlier dates than the Paleo-Indians. And when I was a student, a graduate student, this was causing big, big, big problems. These are some of the people that were, the guy's name was Delahaye, the guy that excavated it, and I remember seeing him talk and saying, he came up with this controversial idea, but hey, that's what scholarship is. You have controversial ideas, and but he got seriously attacked, and for like a decade, people were coming after him. They weren't and they weren't hiring his graduate students. They were just doing everything to stop this pre-Clovis concept. But now it seems to be accepted. And remember, when I was a student, we could see some of these finds, like on the lower right. The gentleman that excavated it just got together all the top scholars in the Americas and flew them down there to look at the finds and the site, and they all had to admit that, yep, it's for real. And so once that happened, we're now pushing back the dates of first Homo sapiens in North America. And here's just what they found at Monteverde: all these wooden artifacts, frames for tents and houses, etc., to reconstruction on the bottom there. And we can see it's a nice little village, and quite early. Now, some other things are popping up as well. This happened very recently, after I had my PhD, so it was in the 90s, I think, the discovery of Kennewick Man, up in the Washington, Oregon area. I forget which state, but I think Washington, and found purely by luck, but dated to pre-Clovis with carbon-14 dates. And we can see how much is preserved for us here. And they've done some reconstructions of Kennewick Man. We can see this cranium is pretty close to ours. Well, it is ours. I mean, they're Homo sapiens. What's controversial about this reconstruction, however, is that they're given whitish skin. And so, that was not appreciated by many people. In the upper right, this guy looked very, European to me. So, that's a problem. But in any case, here's some of the evidence. And so Kennewick Man is really one of the big, big sites now that has changed people's opinion. And here in the upper left, we see, the distribution of some of these sites. So they're all over the place in the Americas. And we see this Kennewick Man's skeleton again. You can see how well preserved it is. A lot of him is there. And we see the skull on the lower left. Now, close studies of the skull with these measurements, which are sort of iffy, I'll come back to that in a moment, have suggested these are descendants of the Ainu. Now, the Ainu are people from a specific island in Japan, now associated with the country of Japan. They have somewhat Western features. I hate to use that term. This gentleman argues that they could be descendants of the Ainu. Now, Hokkaido is the name of the island they're from. Now, this is problematic because to look at, skulls and then assume that they had a different skin color, etc., it's a big jump. I mean, there are variations in skulls, and it's true that, ancient Asian skulls are some of Homo sapiens sapiens are somewhat different than the African ones, and somewhat different than European ones. And indeed, the North American skulls have similarities to the Asian ones. For example, they have what's called shovel-shaped incisors. So the back of their incisors has an indentation in it that is associated with pre-Homo sapiens in the old world, Neanderthals, etc. In any case, we can see there's people coming much earlier than was thought. I would give this all a grain of salt of, this is what these people look like. We really don't know. And, certainly disregard the skin color. Now, one of the really interesting sites that's popped up recently is in the Yucatan in Mexico, and where recently a very, very, very early skull of a young girl was found in one of these caves that are there. I don't know if anybody's ever been down to the Yucatan, but there's a whole bunch of, it's what's called a karstic geology. That's to say it's a bunch of limestone full of water, and this causes collapse in the limestone and lots of caves. That would later, some of which would later get inundated with water. Here we see some guys exploring these caves. Far more industrious than I would ever be for such a thing, and they found. I mean, look at this skull in this cave down here. Now that's an animal skull there, but still just sitting on top of the stone there. And then these underwater skeletons here. And here's sort of a layout of the cave, the people. You can see in the upper right that his skull is a little bit flattened out in the top, but not enough to make it a different species or anything like that. Of course, still Homo sapiens, just slightly different. And you can see the various animals that existed at the time on the bottom right, as I talked about before. All these larger mammals that went extinct. One thing I want to point out is a lot of these large mammals. First of all, large terrestrial mammals are good because they have a lot of meat. Okay, so they were chosen. Secondly, a lot of them live in herds. So it's better to hunt herds than it is to hunt an animal that lives by itself or just its own family. And here we get this wonderful shot of the cave in the lower center here. And this is how they were formed. I talked to mentioned that there's this what's called karstic limestone, which can cause these massive depressions, and with these large sinkholes, which we'll talk more about when we get to the Mayans. But they're good for a lot of periods, quite frankly, because people fell into them, or bodies were disposed of, being thrown in them. We're not sure. But these what are called cenotes or cenotes preserve a lot of our Paleo-Indian finds. And with that, I will stop this lecture on the Paleo-Indian.